Hello, my name's George Fenton, and I'm one of the team members that's been working on the Universal Logistics Standards project. I'm happy today to present to you a tutorial on procurement, the procurement chapter. So procurement is a critical part of humanitarian operations, and of course is an area of significant liability for any organization or business. It's very important to procure in a way that's transparent, accountable, safe, and in alignment with financial, international, and donor regulations. So the process in this chart shows the procure to pay process, which is central to successful purchasing and generally covers steps to plan, identify, select, receive, and pay for goods and services, which are maybe needed. And it's really important that there is a joint planning program between program and the project intervention and procurement, so that you can ensure that the organization can best add value to the goods and services that are being procured. So that joint planning function is really important. It's not just about procurement people doing it. They must do it together with the other stakeholders. By adapting to local or international contexts, procurement activities can then achieve best value for money, i.e. An appropriate balance between all the monetary or non-monetary needs of a program, project, or intervention of some sort. And there must be a balance between the right price, sources, quantity, and quality delivered to the right location at the right time. And so the procurement goal is not to purchase the cheapest or the best quality all the time, but to match these factors to the requirements that exist. So therefore, those responsible also for procurement should strive to ensure the best use of funds or donations, and learn from both successes and failures in order to help modify and adapt the way that goods and services are procured. So the procurement chapter covers standards in 5 things, so largely around planning, best value for money, procurement processes, supplier relationships, and ethics and compliance. So standard 1 is around, and it states here, procurement planning supports timely delivery of goods and services. So what's meant here, and looking at the key actions that are in the chapter, they state things like, it's important for stakeholders to clarify, be as clear as possible what really the needs are, what goods and services or construction works or financial services are needed, what type, quantity, quality, and critically when those products or services are needed. Then make clear specifications based on market availability, ideally looking at the local market, but otherwise regional or international markets, and ensuring that both women and men are involved in making the specifications for those products or services, because often there are different needs of men and women or people of diverse sexual orientation or gender identity. Then you need to evaluate the situation and plan with colleagues, stakeholders, partners, the best procurement method according to the context, or your donors, rules, regulations, and the sources of the products, or possible that you might be able to obtain products directly from manufacturers locally, local suppliers, shops, or indeed you may already have locations where you have stock of your own which can be used. Then you consider how local markets operate, and how suppliers themselves can access and respond to tenders and requests for quotations that you may not launch. And in particular, it's good to consider female suppliers, ensuring that they're not excluded unintentionally from being able to access opportunities. You consider the delivery time, as I mentioned, the best value for money, alignment with project needs and market availability, as well as then the risks associated with sourcing from those markets related to quality or any possible negative impact on activities. Indicators, and these are again mainly related to good planning. They include things like monitoring the percentage of interventions with updated procurement plans, monitoring the variation between the information provided in a budget and the actual procurement plan itself, or the frequency of orders of different types of items. You may be finding that if you're monitoring it, you're continuously ordering the same type of product. So there are other things you can do, which we'll come on to optimize the procurement process. So in general, there are many things to consider, but it's really important that teams collaborate to define the procurement priorities and the procurement procedures that need to be used. Managers must ensure that budgets are aligned with procurement plans. There's good stakeholder communication is critical so that everyone knows how long it will take to get whatever it is they've requested and how much it will cost. And when standard organizational donor procedures cannot be followed, you may have to request what's called a derogation or a waiver in advance. So for example, the purchase of non-standard items or changes to the approval given for the origin of goods, like say cars made in the USA or something like that. And then for things like medical equipment, you may require special verification, special due diligence processes to be followed, or special pre-approvals to be sourced. And then you need to consider issues when procuring supplies or services that may be at risk of forgery, perhaps particularly in the case of pharmaceutical items. So that's very important to watch out for. And then keep your procurement plans up to date, as delays in supply are often due to poor planning. So planning is really the critical piece. Standard 2 states that procurement decisions are oriented to add value to interventions through what we're saying is calling best value for money. So what do we mean by best value for money? The actions here are really to create criteria for selecting suppliers in terms of quality, availability of product, and costs, of course, and then adapting this information to ensure that women and diversity-owned businesses or cooperatives are not prevented or discouraged from bidding. And in that case, you might want to consider limiting the contract size so that smaller suppliers are able to have enough cash flow to support the responding to a bid or a tender, rather, a request for quotations. You need to consider the scope and complexity of the documentation that you're anticipating, including evidence to ensure that women and diversity-led businesses are not unintentionally excluded or discriminated against. You need to mitigate possible risks to the timing delivery of supplies or due to limited supply capacity. And you need to review suppliers' stock availability, their liquidity, past performance, other alternatives to using a particular supplier. if you don't think that they are suitable. But you must document your decisions so that any audit can be addressed. Then you need to compare offers based on a combination of price, quality, availability, and technical capacity, and balance those options, assessing the original requester, providing the original requester with clarity with regard to specifications and the offers that you have been received. So, and working again with the original requester, it's really important to make sure that there are clear specifications and that those specifications are detailed enough to clearly express the needs while not limiting potential suppliers' ability to quote. And then indicators around that are around things like the percentage of orders where time between placing an order and the final delivery is in line with the original expectations, any variation in prices offered versus historical prices, supplier capacity assessments, or the percentage of orders supplied with any quality issues that may be reported. And other points to consider are things like it's good to formalize all procedures as a guidance for implementation, as guidance for implementation of procurement activities, and then set controls for compliance or verification of those. So again, it's very important to establish and communicate the expected time to complete a purchase. And if specific goods or services are ordered frequently, maybe you can optimize orders to obtain discounts or create a long-term agreements to decrease processing time and again save money. So the best value for money, is a mechanism that gathers market information or knowledge, and also considers risks, then you make a choice as to, for high value orders and goods or services with high complexity or particular requirements such as cash or voucher programs, you need to ensure that the use of appropriate contract terms and conditions are applied. And of course, it's good to regularly check and update prices via market surveys and consultation with suppliers. The best value for money is not only about buying the cheapest product. Standard number 3 is around procurement processes. And the standard states that procurement process is designed to be responsive and in proportion to ensure a transparent and efficient use of resources. So the key actions here around considering the procurement strategy really, and the key actions are related to ensuring that you tailor the procurement procedures or documentation to suit your approach to the type of suppliers you're going to be using. And again, paying attention to women-led businesses, etc., ensuring that procedures are appropriate to the market and commonly accepted practices, as this will help to increase supplier participation and collaboration. So the idea is you make sure that you get a good range of choice in suppliers that you need to use to supply a product or a service or construction works. There needs to be some flexibility, therefore, for procurement strategies, particularly in emergencies. And it may be necessary to have rules in place, such as for certain waivers or simplified procedures in order to quickly obtain a product. But in doing so, you need to define thresholds for selecting procurement methods, such as when you can negotiate directly with a supplier or when a competitive procedure or tender is needed. So you need to consider strengthening procurement complexity based on the risks in terms of value, technicality, and impact on the intervention. For example, predefining authorization responsibilities, ensuring appropriate engagement of senior staff in defining the approach. Indicators that are suggested are around ways to select suppliers or process orders. For example, procedures should meet operational requirements and enable appropriate supplier selection and risks to be identified. So there are indicators that you can put in place to monitor that. There's also the percentage of orders that are processed based on specific waivers, or the percentage of orders that are fully delivered in compliance with any predefined terms and conditions. Other things to consider are the need to use flexible contracting tools such as long-term agreements for frequently purchased goods and services, as was mentioned earlier. In an emergency, standard procedures may need to be adjusted during the procurement procedures to quickly purchase goods and services. But again, it's really important to document these changes. Donors may require specific procedures in different situations, so you need to pay attention to that. And for cash and voucher programs, there's a need to consider the financial service fees charged compared to the total transfer value. Above all, there should be a zero tolerance approach to fraud or corruption and any other forms of misconduct. And ideally, there should be a policy forbidding retaliation against anyone reporting any misconduct. But there could be a whistleblowing policy in place to allow people to anonymously report any misconduct. And then as a final point here, when sourcing internationally, procurement staff should have a good understanding of international freight terms, such as Incoterms or international commercial terms. Standard 4 is about supplier relationships, and it states that supplier relationships are transparent and built on fair competition. And here the main actions are to give equal opportunity for suppliers by ensuring that they receive the same information, that there's no charge for them getting that information, that there any advertising in the local media or on notices should be accessible to all people, all suppliers, including women or people of diversity. It's important to verify that suppliers are legitimate and comply with legal and any statutory requirements, and that documents provided are clear and clearly explain the specifications of the products or services that you're looking for, what the quantity is, what the unit of measurement is, what the expected delivery time is, or any other deadlines for responding to the call for quotations or response to tenders. There must be enough time allowed for suppliers to prepare offers, subject to the type and nature of the purchase. And it's important to mitigate supplier selection bias by preventing any conflicts of interests or collusion, fraud, bribery, or any other sort of coercive practices. So therefore, it's really important to segregate staff duties and apply a policy of zero tolerance, making sure that everyone understands the policy. And it's good to assess any potential reasons that staff who are involved in the procurement process or decision-making may have intentionally or unintentionally to favor any specific suppliers. Then separately, it's good to monitor supplier performance and then regularly reassess the market to ensure that any new suppliers can be identified. So some key indicators here are around the percentage of procurement that is performed with a minimum number, say 3 of eligible offers, and procedures that are in place to prevent and mitigate corruption, corrupt practices, or the percentage of actions to prevent and mitigate corruption that are actually implemented. Other things to consider here are it's good practice to provide briefing sessions with suppliers to improve their understanding of expectations. And it's good to allow suppliers to, where it's appropriate, adjust their offers through the provision of additional information or rounds of negotiation where that's appropriate or applicable. It's good to ensure that there's confidentiality of any information about the competitive procurement processes. And you must put in place, as was said earlier, again here, if possible, an appropriate whistleblowing mechanism to ensure that suppliers are informed and able to use them. So it's not only a whistleblowing process for your own staff, but also potentially for suppliers. And then in terms of conflict of interest, if a conflict of interest is identified, even as a potential risk, it's good to assess the causes and implement some mitigation measures in order to eliminate the impact as far as is possible. And the final standard in this chapter, standard 5, is around ethics and compliance. And the standard here states that procurement practices minimize harmful impact to the environment, communities, and markets. So the key actions here are to consider suppliers' compliance with good working practices. For example, they exclude all forms of engagement in child labor, abuse or exploitation, sexual exploitation, human rights abuse, and exploitation of natural resources. You shouldn't use suppliers that have any link to conflict or terrorist activities or connections that might impair humanitarian principles. It's good to ensure that international procurement practices don't unnecessarily compete with locally available alternatives, and consider the effects of procurement on the local market, for example, creating waste. It's good to maintain ethical procurement policies that can inform decision makers and suppliers about conditions for engaging in procurement opportunities. So perhaps include sustainability criteria in the selection process for goods, works, and services. Indicators around this are things like measuring the procurement impact or conducting procurement impact assessments on communities, markets, local markets, and the environment, providing essential information about potential negative impacts and recommended mitigation measures. You can monitor the percentage of these mitigation measures in procurement impact assessments to see whether they have been addressed. And you can monitor the variation in prices of relevant goods and services in the local market during an intervention, or the supplier selection processes where environmental criteria are considered. Other things to look at are mechanisms that can be used to minimize the impact of procurement on communities. So things such as encouraging or actually requiring suppliers to employ vulnerable groups, ensuring that, of course, relevant safeguarding practices are recognized. It's important to engage with communities in planning and whenever possible and appropriate, to prioritize local procurement of goods and services in order to support the local economy, and include market analysis as a key component of any crisis response analysis or intervention analysis generally. And then ways to potentially have a negative impact on procurement, of procurement on the environment can be avoided. And ways that these can be avoided can include things like, considering the nature and origin of materials when supplying or specifying products. It's good to establish, therefore, environmental criteria for goods and services that are frequently procured, and that but may have a significant environmental impact, such as, of course, vehicles. And then it's important to incorporate an environmental indicators such as, low life cycle costs, low CO2 emissions, or good biodegradability of products that you're obtaining, and incorporating that into the market monitoring systems. It's also good to, again, organize briefing sessions with potential suppliers in order to encourage them to further improve their environmental performance and, understanding of what they can do to improve the environmental performance of their products or services. And it's also important to encourage ways to minimize packaging and avoid inefficient use of transport. So above all, it's important to evaluate the life cycle of supplies and equipment. You can then plan for reuse or recycling or reverse logistics in order to minimize any need or opportunities for effective disposal. So thank you for listening, and I hope this was useful.